Good afternoon and welcome to the tutorial on the concepts behind the weighted cost of capital. The weighted cost of capital is an important number in the world of finance in that it looks at what type of return does a dairy need to see, or what type of return does a business operation need to see given the nature of its assets in terms of how much is equity and how much is debt and what is the total amount of assets that are involved in the operation. Now, a dairy, of course, is a business operation, and it consists of the investment in what we call assets. These assets are in the form of the buildings, the cow barns, the stalls, indeed the milking parlors, and also includes the animals themselves and the feed that might be in the barn. All of these assets have value. And typically this value will be in the range, when we put it on a per cow basis, between $6,000 to $15,000 per cow. And now one has to remember that perhaps a large part of this variation in asset values is because of the land component. We can have up from 2 to 3 acres per cow, and land can be very variable depending on the location of the dairy, and thus it will contribute greatly to the assets per cow. Now, when one has assets, one needs to get a rate of return on those assets. And of course, if that rate of return isn't sufficient, then one's going to leave the industry. In other words, I'll take my money and invest it in another business profit that might offer a greater return relative to the inherent risk of one business compared to the other. Now, it's helpful to look at the dairy operation from this perspective. And so here we're looking at it from an accountant's perspective. So an accountant looks at the entire dairy operation as consisting of a whole cadre of assets, as we said, the cows, the buildings, and lands. And then he goes one step further in that he partitions these assets into what component of them are owned by the dairy versus what are liabilities, in other words, outstanding obligations or debt that the owner has. So if we were to sell the entire operation, sell all the assets, so liquidate the farm, sell the cows, the land, the feed in the barn, the milking parlor, the tractors, there'd be a pool of money. However, if that producer owed debt, he'd have to pay off his debt or his liabilities, and he would be left with the equity component of that asset pool. And so we have a situation where, yes, we have a range of assets, but a component of those assets might be actually owned by someone else in the form of a bank. Now, additionally to these physical assets or capital assets, we have what are called intangible assets, and these are assets that bring value to the operation but aren't for sale. These are the managers and consultants, and what these folks do is they help in the decision-making process in terms of deciding what resources, what decisions are we going to make, which investments are we going to pursue. So this whole area of what we call tactical economic decisions, what breeding program, what feed ingredients should we use. All of these tactical decisions involve the use of resources, and what we hope, of course, is to get a return on those resources that, one, exceeds the cost and therefore provides profits to the producer, and furthermore, we want those profits to be sufficiently large enough to help pay down debt and also grow our equity. So in other words, given that you have a pool of assets, you have to make investment decisions that are going to help you ultimately pay your debt obligations and grow your equity. If you can't achieve those goals, you're going to look elsewhere in terms of where you're going to use your asset dollars. And so what's convenient is to put this in the form of a what's called a hurdle rate. In other words, what's a minimal return that's needed to grow the equity component of the assets and the debt assets. So in other words, to grow the wealth of the operation. So when it can exceed our needs to pay debt and also grow equity at a sufficient rate, then we're growing wealth. And so there's what's called the hurdle rate or the weighted cost of capital. Now to calculate this, we can use a analytic that we've created on the web, where on the left here is where you enter in the total assets, and we conveniently divide them into what's equity and what's debt. So here we have for a small herd size, $16,000 debt per cow. It was $3,000 or $16,000 assets per cow. $3,000 of it was debt, and about $13,000 of it is equity. We can see that the leverage ratio of assets to equity is 1.23. We can enter in what is the debt rate. In other words, what's my interest rate on my debt? And of course, you might have multiple forms of debt, so this would be a weighted debt rate. What's your marginal tax rate? And the reason we need to know that is because interest is tax deductible. So interest provides a tax shield, if you will. And furthermore, we have to put in what type of growth do we want to see on the equity component. And so we see that when we take into account the obligation for debt, its tax benefits, and what type of growth rate do we want to see on equity, we come up with what weighted weight of return, what weighted cost of capital do we need to see on the next dollar to grow the wealth of that dairy. If we pursue investments that give us a lower return than this value, then we're not accumulating wealth. We're not meeting our hurdle. And of course, these values are all changeable and influenced by what we say is the underlying equity rate, what is our debt rate, what is our tax shield opportunity, okay? And furthermore, what component of our total assets are equity versus what components of them are debt. In this little menu box here, I have information that we've accumulated from reported data in terms of what is this distribution of debt and equity by different herd sizes. And so these can give you some rough ideas on what we see in herds. In general, smaller herds tended to have a much greater asset per cow. This might reflect where they're located, probably closer to urban centers where land value is much higher. But hence they then need to make sure that they're getting a adequate return on those additional assets. So this weighted cost of capital would be the interest rate that you'd use in net present value calculations that you might have heard of as a way to look at what rate of return do we need to exceed so that we bring wealth to the dairy. If you have any questions, feel free to contact me, Dave Galligan at the University of Pennsylvania. Thank you very much.